today I'm going to be chatting with you about encouraging collaborations with Indigenous communities and specifically understanding the experiences of extension educators working within those communities. Again, I'm coming to you from Colorado today. So this is Colorado State University's land grant acknowledgement. I know I'm so happy to see folks from all over the country joining us today. So I'll just introduce this in hopes of it representing all of the different places we're coming together from today. I'm joining you from the homeland of the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne peoples and nations. This was also an important gathering place for many other nations as well. And so I just would like to recognize that and let you think for a moment about where you're coming from today too. So what's the problem that we're all here to talk about? Again, I know that you folks are my people, and so some of this is old news to you all. But as you know, Extension serves nearly 100% of counties in the United States, but best available research based on questionable census data and things like that. The best we can guess is that Extension is only touching about 10% of Indigenous communities. So again, I'm coming to you from an education equity perspective, and there you go. That's a pretty big gap in educational equity there. And especially because, given the mission of land grants, of equity and access, and the very, I was going to use the word complicated, but that's not strong enough. The complicated history of land grant institutions and Indigenous land dispossession. It is my opinion, and probably yours as well, that Extension has a responsibility to serve Indigenous communities equitably. One way to do that, amongst many, is for 1862 land grants to collaborate with Indigenous communities, either with 1994 tribal colleges, the communities themselves, so that we can provide equitable access to resources and support. This data, just to give you some context, is from the Western region of Extension. So I heard some of my Western region people on the call too. This was a mixed method study. So it included a survey that I got out to as many people in the Western region as I could, whether they had collaborations with Indigenous communities or not. That became important to find out what some of the prohibitive barriers were to creating collaborations. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. There were 307 respondents, 188 had current or past collaborations, and the others had never collaborated. Again, those numbers will come back a little bit later. I also did 20 interviews. Those were specifically with Extension educators that had collaborated with Indigenous communities to get their lived experiences. I asked them things like, what makes you successful? What kinds of programs are successful? What are the major barriers that you face? So that we as a collective in the region and the nation could learn from their good work and the experiences that they've gained working in those communities. I prioritized participants that were Indigenous and non-Indigenous, that were representative of the region in general, because it's a big place, and had varying positions and administrative power. So these are just some of the professional positions that my participants had. Whenever I reference a name or a participant quote, it's a pseudonym, and I don't include those titles or states or reservation names to protect my participants, but I did want you to see an example of some of the varied job descriptions that these folks have. And today I just want to chat with you about the major themes and the findings. So that included things, like I said, like what makes programs successful, what makes educators successful, and then the common barriers that educators face. First, the characteristics of successful programs. There were three major themes here that made programs successful. The first one is that the programs that were particularly successful centered the goals of the community. What I mean by that is that these educators put their communities first and not themselves first. And that can get complicated when we have to meet grant proposal requirements, when we have to, we're given a program and told, go deliver a 4-H program in this community. There's cultures and curricula and things like that that often come along with those things. And so these educators found a way to put the needs of their community first as opposed to the needs of themselves or their institutions first. These folks also usually had an inside collaborator, and what that means is someone from within the community that could be their champion, as one of my participants called them. So this is someone on your side, and they can help give you certainly access, help you understand what's culturally appropriate in that community, and also tell folks when they're doing something wrong. And again, that'll be important in characteristics of a successful educator. My educators were open to being told that they were wrong and should do things differently by their inside collaborator. It's really important. And then lastly, unsurprisingly, the most successful programs were culturally relevant in their programming and their pedagogy. And that goes back to centering the goals of the community. If you're listening to what your community needs and creating programs that are culturally relevant, using culturally relevant pedagogy, again, unsurprisingly, those are the most successful. One of my participants said place matters. And it does. And so certainly physical place, but also cultural place, traditional food ways, and the issues that are facing communities specifically. I include a lot of quotes in this, and I might skip some for time, but my participants had so many incredible things to share. I want you to have a chance to see their quotes. But this quote here, it's one of my favorites, is from Karen. Again, it's a pseudonym, but this is about centering the goals of her community. She said, colonizers around the world would initially try and wipe out the entire indigenous population. And then they would go to the point where they would totally take away their culture. And then we got a little more enlightened and we would go in and say, hi, I'm from the university and we're here to help. But we never asked them what they wanted. And so in countries where they finally wised up and said, we're from the university, what do you need help with? And that took, a century to get to that point. And I still run into people. I get emails from folks wanting to do grant projects in tribal communities, and they've already written the whole grant. They want to, as one of my participants said, check the native box and shoehorn a community into a grant. So it's just a very real world. I get this example all the time and have to say, well, have you asked the community about it? So again, that's a great perspective from Karen about centering her community's goals. Next, characteristics of successful educators. There were more themes here. These educators were involved in their community. This is a great thing about the extension model, and that most, at least county level extension professionals are in their communities, which is great. But people talked about the importance of showing up, going to the high school basketball game, going to the tribal council meeting, showing up in person to talk about a project instead of emailing or calling on the phone, all really important things. That goes along with building trusting relationships, but that's deeper than that. So my participants talked about the importance of following through and listening. That's not always done by university professionals, the follow through part at least. Maybe they'll come in for a year or 3, do some programming and then leave. That lack of sustainability and really damages trusting relationships, and that's something my educators are constantly trying to overcome. Also, they displayed what I called academic understanding. That could be potentially the context of the specific communities they were serving. For example, tribal history, things like that. The history of the US and specifically, again, colonialism and the effects of the ideology of colonialism and how that has lasting effects to today. And also the very specific culture that they were involved in. And again, just back to place matters. Next is willingness to learn. I talked a little bit about that with the inside collaborators. Just to know that you're not the expert in the community, that they are. And again, I say that and it almost sounds like a given, but I think what some of my participants were calling attention to is this tension between the culture of academia and the culture of serving a community. People are often hired because of their technical experience and knowledge. They're expected to be the expert in their content area, but that's not necessarily the best way to show up in a community, particularly if you are an outsider to that community. Showing up as an expert isn't a great way to center their goals. So much better to be willing to listen, willing to learn, and be told when you're wrong. There were some examples of folks that couldn't do that and didn't last very long in these positions as well. And lastly, the most successful educators cultivated a culture of allyship. This is a quote from Carrie. She's Native and works on the reservation that she lives on. She said, it's important to be an ally and a partner than it is to be a leader, because what our ultimate goal should be, whether we're tribal or non-tribal, is fostering ownership and leadership, you know? That's what we need to work ourselves out of a job and have our Native youth take over these jobs as program managers and as scientists eventually. That's our ultimate goal. So I guess just keeping that in mind, you know, you're an ally, you're a partner. And this is specifically important in this context because of tribal sovereignty. And that, you know, working across sovereignty is a really interesting problem because, you know, how the tribe spends money, what choices they make, what programming they want, that's all up to the tribe. And so you're really a partner as opposed to an expert or an educator in these types of settings. Lastly, some barriers to successful collaborations. A lot of this is just logistics. Funding, unsurprising, but I think when we think of funding, it's important to reframe that as prioritization. So funding's an issue, but what does that speak to? It really speaks to prioritization of this work. Also research logistics, IRB, stuff like that, and rural issues. A lot of these communities are very inaccessible, perhaps only by plane, snowmobile, or horse. And so there's infrastructure issues, lack of internet. That's all very difficult to create educational programs within. Educators were spread too thin. As you've already heard, this work takes lots of time to build relationships. It takes consistency. It takes expertise that other kinds of collaborations don't. And if educators are already spread too thin, then investing that might be a prohibitive barrier. My participants also faced some distrust of the government and universities from the communities. And that is for a lot of reasons, historical and current, right? Different worldviews, how agriculture is defined differently between Western academia and some of the groups that in the community, representatives of the government and universities not following through and leaving creates distrust. And then issues of sovereignty. Again, a lot of the choices that we make as educators are actually up to the tribe to make. And so respecting that sovereignty, if not done correctly, can create distrust. And then lastly, racism. So this is both racism, you know, towards the Indigenous communities from the outside, but I had some white participants say that they had been discriminated against too because of their alliances with the Indigenous community. So this quote is about Randall, who was a participant here, who was, quote, shunned by the white community. And Randall's white, but that's because he spent so much time in the Indigenous community and his white community didn't love that. From the survey, I could say a little bit about the barriers that were prohibitive. So these were folks that had not worked with Indigenous communities before, and I asked them why. And they gave me, they reinforced a lot of the barriers and characteristics for successful programs that I've already talked about. So they talked about a need for academic understanding. They didn't know what they were doing and didn't feel comfortable. The importance of trusting relationships and inside collaborators. A lot of folks said that they didn't have those and that felt like an insurmountable barrier. Funding, of course, and just lack of systemic support. So the survey respondent said they needed expertise, relationships, funds, FTEs, supportive administrators. It's a pretty good summary of some really prohibitive barriers. And then just a little bit about discussion and recommendations. These, again, you know, my research was very, I used a decolonizing methodology. I focused really heavily on participation. And so, you know, my participants were involved at every stage. They didn't just, I didn't interview them and hang up and never speak to them again. They were involved with reading transcripts, with you know, coding and findings, and then also with the discussion section. So they gave great recommendations for creating systemic change, and I grouped those into people, education, and culture. We'll start with creating systemic change with people. They really wanted to encourage engagement and collaboration. Some of the most successful universities that are doing this have integrated extension and these Indigenous programs across their entire campus so that they have the most support, the most experts that they can across their whole campus. They resist the siloing that can happen in higher education. And then engagement and collaboration with other educators. There aren't that many people doing this work. And so if you are an educator trying to do it, it can be a really isolating experience without someone to help you with feedback and things like that. And so that doesn't necessarily exist other places where there are more people doing the work. So if we can encourage educators that are doing this work to group together to support each other, then that's really useful. My participants also talked about valuing this work in employee evaluations. And it's really what that means. It's deeper than that. It's more creating pathways for faculty that can create successful careers. So again, if you're judging this work based on number of publications, grant dollars, participation numbers, that's not always the best way. You won't always see the outcomes that you want when working in communities that take a longer time to build relationships. You might not be able to do the same kinds of research that you would in other communities. And that can be prohibitive for educators that can't have successful careers without meeting those more traditional Western academic pathways to success. So that's really important. This quote from Jack is talking about how some of his reservations only have about 100 people and 100 acres, but that's meaningful in that it's hard to convince his administration that he should be focusing on a 100-acre reservation with 100 tribal members when he could have more of an impact, more participation numbers, more grant dollars, more publications if he went to a bigger town. Next, creating systemic change through education. So my participants wanted culturally relevant programs because that was one of the characteristics of successful programs. They wanted help with that, extension could help them create programs specifically for example, 4-H or SNAP education. And then they also wanted professional development opportunities so that they could learn how to create culturally relevant programming themselves. And that speaks to professional development. So that's program development, for example, culturally relevant pedagogy, but also just diversity, equity, and inclusion, professional development in general. And then it was also really helpful for my folks to have an understanding of US and tribal history and the effects of settler colonialism. And lastly, creating systemic change through culture. And I said see above because if we can do all of that from within, then that helps to change the culture of the institution. I also think that we can cultivate allyship. Think about what allyship could look like between extension and Indigenous communities and between educators, individual educators and the individual communities that they are serving. Often in Indigenous and decolonizing work, you see the word solidarity more often than allyship, and how that's different across sovereignty. That's a whole theoretical conversation we can have, but some of my most successful educators positioned themselves as allies, which is, I think, important for this work. And then prioritization, and what I mean by that, I would like to read this quote from a survey respondent about creating cultural change from within. They said, increase cultural competency within extension so that tribal members would be welcomed, valued, and feel seen and comfortable if and when they interacted with extension. This doesn't solve the issue that relationships are not built among extension and Indigenous people in their state, but maybe we need both, transforming our organization internally and building bridges. Thought that was a great conception of, yes, we need the relationship work, we need the how to create programming work, we need the external facing work, absolutely. We also need the internal facing work and how we want to view our culture. just really, I talked about what success means. So I just want to make a note that I use the word success in this work, successful collaboration, successful programs. And I just wanted to make a note that some of my participants directly called out the tension that they felt between how they define success for themselves and their communities and how Extension defines success. And so I alluded to that a little bit about employee evaluations and how we value this work professionally and career-wise, but you know, that wasn't my analysis. That was some of my participants' analysis, that they feel the tension really strongly between how they want to be successful and how Extension wants them to be successful. So we can talk more about that if that's of interest, but that was a big takeaway from some of their experiences. So big picture, what did they have to say about working across cultures? I think we can support efforts to encourage those three big culture change pieces: people, education, and culture. Already talked about some examples, but what does that mean? You know, prioritize this work through funding, resist siloing, spread this work across the whole university, and then encourage or require trainings, as many of my participants wanted. They also need more support. So professional development and networks recognize that this work requires more time, more expertise, and that involves creating career pathways so that educators can take that time, gain that expertise, and still have successful careers. And then have potentially educational and cultural experts to help educators. You know, I don't expect a native plants expert to know how to create a culturally relevant program, but I do think that there are experts, for example, tribal liaisons or diversity and inclusion experts that could help the sciencey technical folks speak the education language and create programs that can be successful in communities. Encourage the characteristics of successful educators and programs and hiring and evaluations. I heard a lot that Extension hires for expertise, and then 80% of the job is talking to people, and so that's important to think about too when you hire folks. And then how do we collaborate with 1994 tribal colleges? And as I say, I know that that's an interest to this group. I just want to say a little about it. I don't want to take too much more time, but I did hear that that was important to you all. So I dug back into the data. That was not necessarily the main interest in this project, although I have worked with Falcon a lot and our 1994s in the West. I did just want to give you an overview of what's happening in the West as far as collaborations with 1994 tribal colleges. So as I said, I had 307 total survey respondents. 188 said that they had current or past collaborations. And then I asked them, if you had current or past collaborations, was any of that with the 1994 tribal college? 9 participants out of 188 out of 307 had current collaborations, and 4 had past collaborations. So that's 13 total, and that's about 7% of my sample had any experience with the 1994 tribal college, and I rounded up. So not great, but that's the point, right? That we need to do better with this. 126, they said they had never worked with the 1994. Many of them said that that's because they weren't near one, which might be true. I also had some great examples of cross state lines and regional collaborations, so I'm not totally taking that excuse. 2 participants had previously worked at a 1994 tribal college and now were at an 1862, but did not currently collaborate. 13 participants were unsure and 34 left the question blank. So that's what's going on in the West. I also have some qualitative data about that too that I'm working on getting together. But I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview, mainly just to say we could do a lot better.